Good morning. Let's begin in prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day that you have made, for the mysteries of your word, and for all the ways that you are made known to us in Jesus Christ. Lord, may his life and his light so govern the way that we read your scriptures, that we would delight in your will and walk in your ways to the glory of your name. Amen. So, welcome to this second of 3 sessions on the role that sex plays in being fully alive to the glory of God, aka welcome to week 2 of Sex Month at St. Mark's, which has a better ring to it. I'm just going to jump right in because I have a lot that I would like to cover. I hope that we get through at least most of it, and I still want to leave you some time for questions. This is not our last session on sex. Just looking forward, next week we're going to have a special week of Fully Alive dedicated to the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to be taking a look at some of his sermons and speeches and drawing out their theology of societal and individual flourishing. You won't want to miss that. And then the week after that, Reverend Elizabeth, Father Peter, and I are going to have a panel of sorts. Elizabeth and Peter are going to interview me about sex. That sounds odd. Why me? Well, I can guarantee you I'm going to try and turn the interview back on them because that's my strategy. But my dissertation work at Yale actually is about sex, okay? So that's what I'm writing my dissertation on. It's about the theology of sex. So please do join us. That'll be the last Sunday in January. So this is not the last chance to have your word about sex. This morning, let me just tell you what I'm trying to do here. I want to take a look at Jesus first, and then at Paul, and then very briefly to remark on what I take to be a few trajectories coming out of all that, coming out of Jesus and Paul in the New Testament, that continue to influence Christian teaching and practice today, certainly in our tradition, but also in a variety of others. What I hope to show is that the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, both do and do not say what we often assume it does about sex. First and foremost, I want to say that the New Testament says a great deal less about sex than we often think it does. And what it does have to say about sex is an awful lot less straightforward than we typically make it out to be. Second, and more generally, I want to say that there is a strand of Christian thinking about sex, drawing out suggestions in Jesus and Paul, which dissociates or distances human flourishing from child rearing, from having kids or making babies, okay? And that this marks the clearest contrast between the New Testament's way of thinking and that of the Hebrew Bible. As we heard presented last week incredibly beautifully by Alison Grusecki. Okay, recall that, as Alison explained to us, procreation and child rearing were matters of human and social survival for the authors of the Hebrew Bible. Not to mention flourishing. Okay, child rearing is required to survive, not to mention be fully alive. It's a very different perspective than what we find in the New Testament. And this is what I want to call the revolution of celibacy. Now, those are not 2 words that you would ever think to put in the same phrase, right? Revolution and celibacy. But I hope to make a case for you that that's actually what's going on in the 1st century and then onward in Christian history. And then I want to suggest in conclusion that the revolution of celibacy is actually a pretty good starting point for us today. Now, clearly I have a lot of work to do, so let's just get going. First, let's take a look at what Jesus actually has to say about sex. The clearest that Jesus ever gets to talking about sex straight on is in the Sermon on the Mount. And here he doesn't say very much. In particular, it's his teaching about lust in Matthew chapter 5, okay, which you see right here. It's these 2 verses, chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. You have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his own heart. Okay? Most of us are familiar with this. If not with this, then we're familiar with the story of Macbeth, which is Shakespeare critiquing, or at least playing with this particular understanding of sin. Macbeth imagines committing a murder, then he's like, well, it must be just as good as committing the murder, so I might as well go ahead and commit the murder because I'm condemned for it. Shakespeare making or poking some fun at this particular understanding of sin. Now, before we get too worked up about the teaching on lust here, we should remember its context. Jesus, in the context of the whole Sermon on the Mount, is tightening up the law. Okay, he's making the law so difficult that nobody can fulfill it perfectly. That's the larger rhetorical context in which this teaching takes place. And he doesn't single sexual desire out as being any more dangerous than any other psychological feature of our emotional life. Okay, it's just as dangerous as anger. And that's why I reproduced verses 21 and 22 there from the same chapter. You've heard it said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you are liable to judgment. Okay, so it's an analogous thing to what he does with adultery. He says it's not just adultery, but lust that's a problem. Here he says it's not just murder, but anger. And what I think he's doing, on my reading anyway, is he's tightening up the law so that it's basically impossible to follow perfectly, so that we have to rely on God's grace and forgiveness. Now, this is not a session on the Sermon on the Mount. You might disagree with me about my reading of the sermon, but that's basically what I think is going on in these texts. He's tightening it up such that we have to rely on God's forgiveness, which is embedded in the prayer that he teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount that says we ask God to forgive us as we forgive our debtors. It's the same sermon in which he says, judge not lest ye be judged, and so on. Jesus also has a bone to pick with other rabbis of his day in that he wants to emphasize the interior character of the moral life. He wants basically to say that it's not just action but intention that matters to God, and his teachings on anger and lust follow accordingly. So that's really the most that Jesus says, at least very clearly, about sex. I'm going to show you some other places where he talks about it. But it's not nearly so clear. This is his teaching on divorce, also from Matthew. And here, in this particular story, Jesus is intervening in an intra-Jewish debate about how to interpret the divorce regulations in the Torah. Basically, he's having a debate with other rabbis, and they are trying to get him to say when a man is justified in divorcing his wife, and that's the way that divorce always worked, okay? Women can't divorce their husbands, only men can divorce their wives. And Jesus says, well, basically never, except in the case of sexual immorality. There. And that's different, that's unique in Matthew as opposed to the version of this passage that we get in Mark. But I'm not so concerned about that. I don't want to get caught up on divorce here. Suffice it to say that the Episcopal Church doesn't follow Jesus' letter here. We're trying to follow the spirit of the thing. So we, of course, the Episcopal Church is a church in which divorce is thought not only to be permissible, but in some cases to actually be the holy thing to do. In addition, in the context of this debate, where Jesus says, no divorce, I think there's actually a case to be made that Jesus is tightening up the divorce regulations precisely to protect women, if you think about the social context in which he lived. Again, remembering that men can divorce their wives, but not vice versa. And remembering that according to one school of rabbinic interpretation contemporary with Jesus, women could be divorced simply for burning dinner. Okay, that was a sufficient reason to divorce your wife according to one school of interpretation. Okay, a debate between that school and other schools is exactly the conversation Jesus is intervening in this passage. Okay, so given that, I tend to think that Jesus is trying to protect women and trying to prevent them from becoming economically destitute as a result of hasty, unfair, unjust divorces from their husbands. But this is not a session on divorce. What I want to focus on is his response to the disciples at the end of this teaching. So Jesus gives the teaching, says you can't ever get divorced, and then and then his disciples say, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry at all. And Jesus says, well, okay. AKA, don't threaten Jesus because he just might take you up on it. It's a good lesson to all of us. He goes on to say, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. So what does Jesus mean? This passage has been commonly interpreted as Jesus just enjoining people to celibacy. I don't think it's that easy. That may be part of what Jesus is after here, but it's not the whole of it. Because the word eunuch in Jesus' day would have been incredibly offensive. It's basically a slur, and here's why. Eunuchs are an ancient gender category, okay? There is no modern equivalent to a eunuch. There are analogies, but we have no modern equivalent. We need to be careful in general when we're talking about gender and sex, not to back project modern conceptions into the world of this ancient text. This is a category which is indigenous to the first century Greco-Roman context, not to ours. Within this umbrella category of the eunuch includes castrated men and those whom we today might call intersex, okay, people with mixed genitalia. They were both social and sexual outcasts in Jesus' day. According to the historian Megan de Franza, eunuchs were entrusted with the most intimate and powerful responsibilities, and yet suffered the reputation of being untrustworthy on account of their physical condition. They were simultaneously considered asexual and unable to restrain themselves from sexual passion. The physical ambiguity of eunuchs was translated into the moral realm in areas well beyond sexuality. Eunuchs suffered the same aspersions of character as did women in the ancient world. They were carnal, irrational, voluptuous, fickle, manipulative, and deceitful. So Jesus is taking an ancient gender category of a group of people who are under social and sexual suspicion, okay, because they have an ambiguous gender identity, to use a modern term, with some fear and trembling, but they have an ambiguous gender identity, and they have access to domestic spaces that, particularly to women's spaces, that lead people to have all kinds of suspicions about what the eunuchs might actually be doing in those women's spaces. As I said, even the very word eunuch was thought to be incredibly rude and offensive, making it very embarrassing to early Christians, which I think shows us that this is definitely an authentic saying of Jesus. Okay, I'm not usually, you guys know me well enough to know I don't care a whole lot about the historical Jesus, but if you do, he definitely said this, okay? Because it would have been so embarrassing to the assembly, to those who were assembling the early texts, that they would have done everything they could to keep it out, unless they just couldn't. Unless Jesus was infamous for having actually said this. So moving on. So much for what Jesus said. What did Jesus do? Well, Jesus was infamous for hanging out with sexual sinners or deviants, prostitutes, people accused of adultery, eunuchs, and the like. And here are just two examples, one from Matthew and one from Luke, of the very common ways in which Jesus was criticized in his day. They say things like, this fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. He eats with sinners and tax collectors. Sinners there being an umbrella category that historians think would have included sexual deviants. We also have the famous story of the woman at the well in John chapter 4. The well still being in Jesus' day as it was in ancient Hebrew culture, as Allison said last week, basically the bar, okay? It's where you go to meet people. And this is, recall, the woman who has been married 5 times and is currently cohabitating or shacking up with somebody else. To the disciples' astonishment, Jesus hangs out with her. Okay? He doesn't shy away from her. And they have one of the most moving and poignant exchanges in all of Scripture, the living water story. It's interesting to me that Jesus doesn't exactly say to the woman here, "Go and sin no more." Notice what he says. So she says, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "Yeah, you're right, you have no husband, because you've had 5, and the one you're with now isn't your husband. What you have said is true." And that's it. That's actually all that he says about the woman's life. He doesn't say to the woman, "Go and sin no more," which is what he says in the 7th chapter of John with the woman who's caught in adultery and is about to be condemned to be stoned. Do you guys remember that story? Jesus intervenes. They're about to condemn this woman to stoning. He intervenes and he says, "Ye who is without sin should cast the first stone." Then he writes something in the ground, and everybody goes away one by one, leaving nobody. And at the end, he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Jesus doesn't actually say that to the woman who's shacking up with her husband. Now, I don't mean to say that Jesus was okay with cohabitation before marriage. That's trying to extract an answer to a question Jesus probably didn't even know how to ask in his particular day. But we don't, as a matter of fact, know what this woman did with the man. Did she marry him? Did she leave him? Did she stay? We don't know. The text doesn't think it's remarkable enough even to comment on. And what I do want to say is that sexual transgression, real or perceived, does not seem to factor into whether Jesus is willing to associate with you. And it doesn't, to my mind, seem to be a particular concern of the early biblical writers either. They just don't make that big a deal of it. And with that, that's basically what we know about what Jesus did and said about sex. Okay, it's not very much. It is something, but it's not very much. So here's a question. Was Jesus single or not? Now, this is the reason why you guys came to church, to hear Father Justin rattle on about the Da Vinci Code. Now, make no mistake, celibacy was quite rare in the world of Second Temple Judaism. Okay, the culture, the religious culture which Jesus inhabited. It was something that was reserved for particular Jewish sects, Jewish sects like the Essenes. Some historians speculate that celibacy may have been a part of John the Baptist community's way of life. It would have been characteristic of his hard asceticism in other parts of his life, his fasting, he's eating locusts and honey, and so on. But we really don't know. We're given no indication in the Gospels or in any extra-biblical texts. It stands to reason, the reason why I bring that up is it stands to reason that because Jesus was so inspired by John the Baptist in other ways, that perhaps he took on John the Baptist's celibacy too. We really just don't know whether or not John the Baptist was celibate. And we're given no indication by the Gospels that Jesus was married. And the idea that Jesus has not been married, was never married, has been the tradition of the church from the very beginning. And I'll say something about that in just a second, because that might seem surprising to you. But I want to say it has basically been the univocal witness of Christians back to the very beginning. Now, whether Jesus was unmarried because he was inspired by John the Baptist, don't know. Or whether he wasn't an avowed ascetic celibate, but perhaps just ran out of time before he got married. That's another possibility. Perhaps he simply wasn't interested. Perhaps Jesus had desires which today we might consider to be asexual. Perhaps that's a possibility. I don't think we can know. Okay, we just don't have the information there. But there simply is no historical evidence whatsoever that Jesus was married or was sexually active, full stop. And given that, I don't think we have any justification for doubting the church's tradition from its earliest days. Now, you guys are asking, what about Mary Magdalene? Okay, There's one text and one place in the text that might be used to say Jesus had a relationship with her. It's the Gospel of Philip, discovered in a cave near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. The first thing to know about the Gospel of Philip is that most historians date it to the 200s, that is, to the 3rd century of the Common Era. To put that in perspective, that is a full 150 years after Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, and the rest of his letters. 150 years after Paul wrote. Okay? It is older by almost a century than all 4 of the canonical Gospels. The reason why I make a big deal about this is because I don't buy ecclesiastical conspiracy theory, and I would encourage you not to either. Okay? The conspiracy theory version of church history goes something like this. It says that the Gospel of Philip was hidden away by the nasty early church fathers in order to prevent people from discovering Jesus was actually married, that sex was actually a good thing, and that sex can be a good thing for us too. Now, there's one passage that describes Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of Philip as Jesus' koinonos, or his companion. And that word koinonos in Greek can have sexual connotations, but it can also just as easily be used as a metaphor for spiritual partnership or companionship. So, even in the one so-called Gnostic Gospel that mentions Mary Magdalene and Jesus, the Gospel of Philip, we do not have a definitive statement that Mary Magdalene and Jesus were sexually active together or that they were married. It says that they were spiritual companions or partners, and the rest is left to connotation. It's implicit at best. It does suggest that Mary Magdalene was particularly close to Jesus, but that's not inconsistent with the canonical Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of which are significantly earlier than the Gospel of Philip, as I said. So if you think I have an axe to grind, or perhaps a paycheck to collect as a priest, then don't trust me, trust a reputable historian like Bart Ehrman, who's a professor of New Testament at UNC Chapel Hill, who doesn't identify as a Christian, but rather is an avowed agnostic or atheist, okay? So this guy should have no ideological agenda except the history. And here's what he says from his book, Peter, Paul, and Mary Magdalene. It is not true that the marriage of Mary and Jesus is repeatedly discussed in the Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament. In fact, it is never discussed at all, never even mentioned, not even once. And it is not true that the Gospel of Philip calls Mary Jesus' spouse. Period. Okay, so people are trying to sell you something. They're trying to sell you books or movies or something like that. And I just, as a scholar, I don't find those claims to carry basically any water. Sorry that I'm coming out so strong here, but I'm speaking partly as somebody who spends a great deal of time actually researching this particular topic, and I just don't buy it. I also don't think it's theologically good for us, and here's why. I actually think it's really good for Jesus to be unrelatable in some ways. It's incredibly fruitful for us just to let Jesus be Jesus, even in ways that make him very different from us. In this case, I think that grappling with Jesus' singleness can invite us to think about how human sexuality is much more expansive than what often goes by the ordinary name of having sex. So hang with me here. Jesus was fully human, and so it follows that he was a fully sexual creature just like every one of us. He had the same sexual drives and desires which are common to all of us. We don't know how they played out in his particular case, but because he's fully human, he had them. He was a sexual creature. Saying that Jesus was most likely unmarried and celibate doesn't do away with any of that, and neither does it imply that he never had any connection to anyone that we might call erotic. The reason why I've chosen the Caravaggio here, the incredulity of Thomas, which is difficult to see, but it's this is Jesus pulling Thomas's hand into his side, which is, of course, Caravaggio taking some liberties with the text here. We don't know if Jesus actually helped Thomas put his hand in his side, but he did invite him to do this. This is one of the resurrection appearances. This is an incredibly intimate and erotic scene in the Gospels, and it's not the only one. I think that most modern people operate with a half-baked understanding of sexuality that they think is generally inspired by Sigmund Freud, but which is actually definitively not what Freud happened to say himself. Namely, that we have sexual urges and that we have only two options of what to do with those sexual urges. We can express them or repress them. And if we repress them, they lead us to all kinds of pathologies, acting out, and neurosis. That totally ignores the possibility of what Freud himself called sublimation. That is, the possibility of channeling our sexual urges towards particular, even apparently non-sexual ends. Just because Jesus was never in the missionary position doesn't mean he didn't have a sexual life. You can quote me on that. It just means that his sexual life took a particular shape, and that particular shape happened to be different than the one lived by most of us in New Canaan, Connecticut. We do not have to make Jesus hetero-married for him to have something to say to us about sex. And if we think that the only way Jesus would have anything to do with a sexual life is if he were hetero-married, ought to give us pause. I can speak more about that in a couple weeks in the interview if you're curious. Thanks, Joe, for the lights. Now I need to say a little something about Paul before we run out of time. Paul talks about sex mostly in two contexts, his vice lists and his distinctive take on marriage. And I want to start with the second of these, his take on marriage, because it relates to the conversation about celibacy that I just invited us to. This is Paul's discussion of marriage in 1 Corinthians 7. And Paul says basically this: human beings have sexual urges, and some people can get by without expressing those urges in sex. That is, they can sublimate them, to use Freud's term, in other ways. And some people can't get by without expressing those urges in sex. He says that he basically wishes that all were as he is, celibate and single. But he says each has a particular gift from God. Some people have the gift of celibacy and some don't. And for those who don't, it's not at all wrong to get married. In fact, if you are married, Paul says you should attend devotedly to the sexual needs of your partner. Now, there's something you probably did not expect to hear Paul said, but that's exactly what he says here. You are to attend devotedly to the sexual needs of your partner. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time to devote yourselves to prayer. Okay, so it's like take a break during Lent or something like that. Okay, don't focus on, here's what I think is so remarkable. The fact that Paul says, do not deprive one another. And that this is the context of where he says that the wife's body doesn't belong to her, but neither does the husband's body belong to him. They belong to the other. Okay? You say, attend to your partner's sexual desires. Now, okay, note the order of priority here, because there are versions of Christianity that say it's a universal Christian vocation to go out and have as many kids as possible. Notice what doesn't come into Paul's equation here at all. Kids. Where is procreation mentioned? Nowhere. This is an extreme departure from the sexual worldview of the Hebrew Bible that we discussed last week, for which child rearing was the end-all be-all of sex's contribution to human flourishing. That's nowhere in Paul. And that's what I want to call the revolution of celibacy. And the revolution of celibacy has effects both for those who are sexually active and for those who aren't. If you aren't sexually active, Paul says, stay that way. Good for you. But if you are, then your focus should not be on having more kids, but on fulfilling the sexual needs and desires of your spouse. That is a massive shift, and it's going to prove incredibly important. So why does Paul say this? What argument does he give? What's the motivation behind this decentering of the procreative demand? Well, scholars have nearly universally agreed that it's because Paul thought the world was going to end tomorrow. And if the world is going to end tomorrow, then you don't need to have any more kids. That is, it's because of Paul's eschatology. Eschatology is a fancy word for his theology of the end. He thought Jesus was coming back, and so he didn't need to have any more kids. We had enough already. A little further down in 1 Corinthians 7, this becomes clear. I'm going to skip the rest of this. Basically, he says he's trying to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. He's concerned that we no longer need to have any kids because Jesus is coming back, and being married can distract you from paying attention to God, is basically what Paul says. We might disagree with Paul, but that's the reason why he says what he does about you should, if you're single, stay that way, don't get married. He thinks that we have a finite amount of devotion to give to God, And so given that, we should give as much of it as possible. And if we're having to devote ourselves also to our spouses, then that's going to get things off whack. It's more efficient just to devote yourself to God, is what he says. Now, it would be irresponsible of me to stand up here and to talk about Paul without saying something about Paul's vice lists, and particularly about the question of same-sex sexual desire and activity. To summarize, Paul never said anything about homosexuality, nor did he ever issue a blanket condemnation of all same-sex sexual activity. Now, you might be surprised to have heard me say that, but the trouble here, the confusion, is being caused by a variety of mistranslations, or perhaps better, overzealous translations of the Pauline texts. So let's take a brief look at the 1 Corinthians vice list here. Noting first that vice lists were a literary convention of Paul's day. Paul's not the first person who does this. They're a list of things which any and everyone Paul was writing to would have considered to be wrong. Paul's on his way to another point entirely, and that other point is what's most important in the context of the letter. The literary point of the vice list is not so much the vices themselves. Okay, those were all taken for granted. They're things that everybody would say were wrong. Instead, the literary point is whatever broader point Paul was trying to make. Here, it's basically that if you're baptized, you're going to live a holy life. You're not going to be about any of the vices that you used to be. But even given that, let's look at what he says those vices are. Let's take just verse 9, the first part of the vice list. Notice the difficulty here with the translation. I have the NRSV, the New International Version, the King James Version, and then the Greek. As far as the two terms at the end, malakoi and arsenokoitai, as far as those are concerned, I have to rely wholly on a very excellent essay by a Yale scholar named Dale Martin. I'd be happy to share that with anybody who'd like it. Just to say, I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm a theologian, and I'm not a scholar of ancient Greek. Ancient Greek is not one of my languages. So I'm relying on somebody else's work here. But here's Dale Martin's understanding of it. The New International Version makes this list the clearest and most unambiguous condemnation of homosexuality, okay? It takes malakoi and arsenokoitai and turns it into men who have sex with men. Notice, they're not concerned about women. Paul will get concerned about women in Romans 1, but even that doesn't say exactly what we think it does. Here it's just men who have sex with men. What I want to say is that this is an exceptional editorial choice on the NIV's part, and it's ideologically motivated. It makes Paul out to say a whole lot more than he actually says. Martin's article starts with arsenokoitai, the last word here in the Greek. And he reminds us that vice lists conventionally assemble sins in a specific order. That is, they list sins or vices that have to do with one another in a sequence. The order isn't just random. It moves in this case from basically sexual sins to economic ones that to sins that disturb the social peace. Okay, so notice you go from fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, to thieves, the greedy, to drunkards, revilers, and robbers. Okay, so they all have something to do with one another. And before you get, well, wait a minute, what's idolaters doing up there? Idolatry was conceived of, particularly in Paul's Jewish circles, as being a result of, as leading to sexual deviancy and promiscuity. So idolatry actually is it makes sense that it's classed with those sexual sins. And Martin observes that in the ancient world, arsenokoitai doesn't often fall with the sexual sins. It most often falls in extra-biblical texts with economic ones, which suggests that in this passage, arsenokoitai actually makes a great transition between malakoi and thieves. Okay, that's why it's in that transition point. It's not just a sexual sin, it's also an economic one. Martin explains that we really don't know what arsenokoitai means. It's a very rare word, but that its context in these ancient vice lists suggests it means one who engages in, as he puts it, some kind of economic exploitation, probably by sexual means, rape or sex by economic coercion, prostitution, pimping, or something of the sort. So it's not quite the blanket men who have sex with men that the NIV assumes. Now, what about malakoi? There, Martin says historians actually have a lot more evidence to go on, and they can say with some clarity that it means effeminate. That's what the word malakoi means. But we need to unpack what effeminate means. Here, the NRSV is too specific, as it were. It turns malakoi into male prostitutes, and oddly enough, the King James Version turns out to be the right one. The King James is closer to it. Now, to understand why Paul would have thought malakoi or effeminates to be vicious, we need to know a little something about his conception of gender. The ancient Greco-Roman world around Paul conceived of sex in a very different way than we do today. Okay, modern people have historically made two kinds of distinctions, both of which have come under increasing pressure nowadays. I'm happy to talk about that some other time, but hang with me here. The first kind of distinction is between man and woman. Two categories which encompass all human beings who are assigned strictly to one or the other on the basis of their genitals or reproductive organs. This is sex. And this leads us to the second distinction that moderns make, which is a biological category or classification. And sex is distinguished from gender, gender being the particular way in which one performs one's identity according to the cultural conventions of one's day, what one's culture considers to be characteristically male or female behavior, masculine or feminine. I'll just say that as someone who now lives in New England but who grew up in the South, I have remained biologically male, but my form of masculinity is much more masculine in New England than it is in the American South. So gender cultural, sex biological, that's the basic modern picture. Contrast the ancient world, according to which there was no strict distinction between sex and gender, nor between male and female, but rather gender was something which was fluid. It existed along a spectrum. And before we get too excited about that, it was a spectrum with a hierarchy. And the male was good and the female was bad. Okay, that's why I put an up arrow. You want to get more male. And this is where malakos comes in. It refers to the effeminate in a derogatory way. Martin says that malakos can refer to many things: the softness of expensive clothes, the richness and delicacy of gourmet food, the gentleness of light winds and breezes. When used as a term of moral condemnation, the word still refers to something perceived as soft: laziness, degeneracy, decadence, lack of courage, or to sum up all these vices in one ancient category, the feminine. Okay, so this is a condemnation that is inextricably linked to misogyny, to the patriarchal character of the Greco-Roman culture. Now, certainly, being penetrated is one of the ways you could get accused of being malakos, or soft, or effeminate. But to be clear, writers contemporaneous with Paul would have also condemned a man being penetrated by a woman as much as a man being penetrated by a man. And really, this is concerned not with the penetration as such, but with the effeminate character of that act. You're born up here, so why in the world would you give that up to come down here? That's basically the ancient way of seeing things. Now, that doesn't mean that malakos is exclusively sexual. In Dio Cassius, Plutarch and Josephus Martin explains, cowards are malakoi. Malakoi are men who live lives of decadence and luxury. They drink too much wine, have too much sex, love gourmet food, and hire professional cooks. So there. Sounds like Paul would have a problem with a great many of us in New Canaan, Connecticut, regardless of our sexual preferences. And that's exactly what I mean to point out here, that Paul's way of thinking about gender and sexuality is dictated by the culture he's lived in, and that culture is largely and very foreign to us. When Paul seems to refer to same-sex sex acts, he very often means something much more narrow and specific than what we would call homosexuality, and he does so for reasons that seem strange and even offensive. As a theologian, I think that biblical interpretation is the act of prayerfully listening to what God has to say to us by means of these texts, by the power of the Holy Spirit. It's an act that's informed by the church's tradition and normed by the specific way that God has been revealed to us in Jesus. As Martin himself raises in his article, St. Augustine himself has set the bar for biblical interpretation here. Augustine writes in his De Doctrina Christiana, "Whoever therefore thinks he understands the divine scriptures or any part of them, so that it does not build the double love of God and of our neighbor, does not understand it at all." So that's the question. how do we interpret this set of texts in such a way that they build up the love of God and neighbor? No less preeminent an authority than Augustine himself tells us that's the way to read the Bible. And the Episcopal Church has accordingly, over the last several decades, come to the conclusion that God does not mean to communicate to us by means of these passages that we need to order our lives according to the particularities of the ancient sex-gender system, nor that we need to inherit the prejudices and judgments that ancients made on that basis. This is behind our reason to change the marriage canon to render them gender neutral, to where any two people of any gender identity can be married in the Episcopal Church, among other decisions, which I'm happy to answer questions about either today or some other time. So to recap, the Bible both says more and less than we think it does. Jesus in general says a whole lot less about sex than we might expect him to, although he is very serious about social ostracization and its effects. Namely, he says Christians ought to emulate somebody who in his day was very socially ostracized on account of their sexual identity. And he never seems to think that sexual sins are worth not associating with somebody. Like Jesus, Paul was single and celibate, I think, and encouraged others to be as well if they could stand it. At issue, as I said, was the amount of time, energy, and devotion and love they would have available to give to God. And of course, Paul didn't think that getting married and having sex was bad. To the contrary, he encouraged couples to take sexual care of one another. Under the influence of the culture he lived in, he did issue condemnations of certain forms of sexual activity. And these condemnations today might seem strange or even unnecessary to us. I certainly feel that way with regard to sexual softness or effeminacy, although I would agree with Paul that economic exploitation by any means, certainly sexual means, is worth condemnation. But in his eschatological fervor, he did us a massive favor. He set Christian thinking about sex on a course beyond the merely procreative or reproductive. Notice that neither Paul nor Jesus are concerned about having any kids. I don't say this because I think having kids is bad, okay? Don't take that away. That's how I'm going to be quoted in the Advertiser. Father Justin Crisp of St. Mark's in New Canaan says that Christians ought not to have kids. That's not what I'm saying. I'm pointing out that kids don't enter into their conversation about sex because Christians often assume that it has to. And the question of whether or not sex must necessarily be procreative has determined Christian debate about sex from Paul and Jesus' day until now. For the great majority of Christian history, the possibility that sexuality might have some meaning beyond just making babies was limited to those who could express their desires through celibacy. But with the invention of contraception, it became possible even for different sex couples to attend to the pursuit of their sexual desires distinct from having a child. And whether or not this is a good thing or not determines where contemporary, modern Christian denominations fall on the question of sex. Anglicans, for our part, changed our minds in 1960 when we admitted with Paul, I think, that sex has meaning beyond procreation, and so therefore contraception was acceptable. I'm intervening in that continuing conversation in my dissertation. That's what it's about. Suffice it to say, I think it's a good thing that sex isn't necessarily procreative, because I think it's a good thing sex isn't necessarily useful. Things don't have to be useful in order to be good. Because what if we were not made to be useful? What if we were just made for joy? And that's where I'm going to end it today. I have time. I'm very sorry that it took so long. A great deal of material, and I hope that it sets up our conversation here in 2 weeks. I think I have time for maybe one question. Not to put any pressure on anybody, but anybody with a burning question that can't wait for 2 weeks from today. I shouldn't have said that. Anybody with a question at all? How about that? Thank you, Cindy.
I'm just curious, now that you've brought up the church's position on homosexuality, what is the Episcopal Church's position on people living together when they're not married?
I'll say that the church's official position is in flux. Okay, so our general convention has been in conversation about what marriage is. We have commissioned several studies of what marriage is, and in those studies they have discussed whether or not marriage needs to be normative for all Christian couples, or simply for all Christians. Given these reports have also taken account of the fact that culturally, in the West, people are getting married much later than they used to. And so because of this, they often become sexually active before they get married. I don't necessarily know that people are becoming sexually active a whole lot earlier than they ever have. What I know for sure is that they're getting married later than they ever have. That's what I think is the historical trend. And so we are currently discussing that. So that's basically a non-answer because the Episcopal Church doesn't have a clear answer. I can't stand up here and tell you that it's the official teaching of the Episcopal Church that cohabitation with a spouse, cohabitation with another person in a sexually active relationship outside of marriage is the Church's teaching. What I can say is that it very well could be the Church's teaching in 10 years or 20 years, and that right now we are in a place where we are just trying to allow Episcopalians to make as healthy and holy decisions as possible. So how's that? Okay. I guess I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.